Hello, this is Miss Dagenford, and after a couple of tries, I've got this working. Had to restart the computer, always fun thing to do. We're going to just set the stage for tomorrow's discussion about speciation and talk about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and its implications. Now, we've talked about the equations, and you'll notice in this packet that you have just some background about the equations, but we've talked about that for a couple of days. So let's just revisit the equilibrium theorem. These conditions need to be met in order for the population to be stable, the frequencies to be stable. If all of these things, then the same alleles should be there over in the same frequency. So they will not change in a population if these are true. Now, we've talked about these already. Population size should be large. The greater the population, the less chance of what we call genetic drift. Number two, no natural selection. All animals have the same chance of surviving and reproducing. Same fitness. No new mutations. All alleles are stable. There's no change. Number four, random mating. All animals have the same chance of reproducing and reproduce in the same way. And then there's no emigration or immigration. Now, if these are not met, then we're going to see the population change in the allele frequency. And in a very strict boundary, we would say that microevolution is happening. Now, evolution as well. They've kind of gotten away from differentiating between micro and macro, but the term is still around. We would view this as the beginnings, right? The population starts changing. Now, the nice thing about the Hardy-Weinberg theorems is that you can use these to kind of examine what happens. For instance, we'll look at genetic drift, what happens there. We'll look at selection, what happens there. And we'll look at, we've already talked about mutations. And then we'll also talk about emigration and immigration. So let's unpack these. That's just another review for the numbers. So the three main mechanisms that can alter the allele frequencies, we've got this genetic drift, this idea of genetic drift, natural selection, and gene flow. Now, these can all go back to those 5 statements. Genetic drift, and you want to focus on that idea of drift, right? Drifting, you can think about the randomness of drifting, something just drifting along the water. Well, that idea is given to this idea of a gene pool. If you have all of the alleles in a population, there can be this just change, and it's a random event that causes an increase or decrease in the specific alleles. Now, this is not the example of the rock pocket mouse that we looked at today. That was selection. Genetic drift would be this idea that something happens to just randomly change the numbers. A lot of times these are things that are environmental in nature, such as floods, streams diverging that would separate populations, or take away a certain number of plants and their seeds. And so, for instance, in this example, if you suddenly only have 2 plants that survive to leave offspring, what if these are the plants that survive just randomly? Just, the stream goes through and wipes out these other flowers. If these are the only plants that survive to reproduce, then look at what happens suddenly to the next generation. You can have a wildly big change in the frequencies of the red allele. So the key to this is not directional. These are random events. Again, a tree falls and squashes a certain population of beetles, and then that changes. Now, this is going to occur. This is going to have a greater effect if it's a small population. So there's a couple of things that can occur with genetic drift. we can have something called the founder effect. And so you want to think about like the founding fathers. The founding fathers, well, just in the case of founding fathers, these are a few individuals that find new habitat. They are the founders. Now, islands are a phenomenal example of this, but it doesn't need to be an island. It could be a volcanic area after the lava flows. You've got this barren area, and then suddenly you have a few seeds that land. And then in that case, because there's only a few, those few seeds could carry a certain frequency of alleles that the original population didn't have. So a lot of the idea, and we saw this with the anoles, right, with the anole lizards, where you had a bunch of lizards in the island, the original mainland, and then they drifted to the islands, and because of that, we might call those founders. The finches are going to be another good example. So founder effects, because they are usually small numbers in a population, they can be a good example of genetic drift, where they just happen to be the ones that have a certain amount of the alleles. And then another example would be a bottleneck effect, and this is what I was talking about with the environmental, where just as in a bottle with a certain number of colored beads, if you shake the bottle, and then here we have that bottleneck, where because it's limiting the number of individuals that come out, you might notice that we've lost the yellow phenotypes in here. Well, that means the surviving population, guess what? There's just no yellow anymore, or certainly it would be far fewer individuals that might carrying that allele. So notice in both of these examples, we're going to greatly change the frequencies in these populations, and that's going to affect the evolution of that population, that change. Now, genetic drift is most significant in small populations, and I mentioned in class, this is why we worry so much with endangered species. You know, if you get down to a certain number of individuals, we've lost alleles in the population, and that affects the fitness of the entire population. Don't forget, as we sum it up, genetic drift can cause the frequencies to change randomly. This is going to cause a loss in variation. And the problem with that is we've lost the yellow allele. We would say that those have become fixed. We can't recover that once it's gone. So those are some of the implications. Now, gene flow is going to be the migration in or out. And remember, that was one of our stipulations of the Hardy-Weinberg conditions, that there's nobody going in, nobody going out. So if there is, that's going to be affecting the allele frequencies. So this could include migration. This another good example would be plants with pollen, bringing the pollinators invading a new area. They affect the pollen that they bring, can affect the allele frequencies. Animal movements across land bridges or across canyons, and then that's going to change the frequencies. And then the one that we'll look at more is natural selection. And natural selection is not going to be random. Now, the mutations can be, the changes at the genetic level can be random, but selection isn't. It's adaptive, meaning that the fitness level is going to be affecting whether or not they survive or reproduce. So we would refer to the relative fitness dependent upon the environment. Now we're going to look at this from how strong the fitness is. So some organisms, like the pocket mouse, that had a strong fitness. The darker coloration allowed it to survive better. So it had a stronger fitness. Others, it might not be a huge effect. So the greater the fitness difference, the more strongly the change is going to lead to changes within the population. It's not gonna take a long time to see that effect. And they mentioned that in that video with the pocket mouse. Now, when we look at selection, selection can cause a couple of things that in a population. It can be disruptive, where you're selecting for extremes, where one section of the population might be being selected for camouflage, and then the other section of the population might be selected for mimicry, and so eventually those two populations diverge. It could be a stabilizing selection where kind of that middle ground is selected for. The extremes aren't good, but the middle ground is adaptive. That survives. And then we see a directional where the entire population shifts in one direction or the other. That would be the pocket mouse. And we'll look at examples tomorrow in class for each of these. And we'll come back to sexual in just a second. But here's an example using our little pocket mouse. Stabilizing would be where we see the original population, we see this middle color, this brown. Well, if that's the fittest, notice the graph afterwards, over generations, more of those mice survive. They fit. In the case of the rock pocket mouse video, we saw either a light form or a dark form survive, but maybe not the middle of the road. If it's right in the middle, the predators could see it both on the sand and the dark volcanic soil. So that would be disruptive. Notice the middle is selected against, the extremes are selected for. And so we'd see the change in the frequency of those two forms. And then directional would be where we see everything kind of shift in one direction. So in this case, we're seeing only the dark ones survive and not quite the light ones. Now, sexual selection is an interesting case because we're talking about what can happen between the male and female of the species. And so this would be where you have competition within the same gender, like males competing. And again, this goes back to Hardy Weinberg. Everybody has an equal chance of mating. Well, no, they might not. The males compete and the females choose oftentimes. So if the females are choosing, well, not everybody has an equal chance of mating. The females are going to choose the male with the best song or the best plumage, or the males are going to win the right to have the harem of the deer and the right to mate. So those sexual selection, that's going to affect as well the traits. Now, if you have ever seen those gorgeous birds of paradise, you can always wonder, like, why in the world do they have such ridiculous plumage, which would seem to be a disadvantage? Like, why in the world would that allow them to survive? They stand out. So we're going to look at that tomorrow. I want you to be thinking, and I gave you a bit of a hint, and that's to do with the fact that the females choose. And so just ponder that for a little bit. So that gets us really going, and here's we'll talk about what they're doing with the frogs there a little bit. So that gets us started on the idea of how do we study this fitness and speciation, and we'll be prepared to hit the ground running tomorrow. Have a great night.